What if I told you that the most evil person who ever lived looked exactly like your grandfather? The 12th of November, 1934. A mother opens her mailbox and finds 6 pages that will destroy her sanity forever. The letter begins innocently enough. My dear Mrs. Budd. But by the final sentence, she's screaming in the street, because this letter describes exactly how her 10-year-old daughter was murdered and eaten in excruciating detail, written by the man who did it. The same man who had dinner at her table, who played with her children, who seemed so kind, so trustworthy, so normal. But here's what makes Albert Fish truly terrifying. He didn't just kill Grace Budd. He bragged that he had abused or eaten a child in every U.S. state, over 100 children, 40 years of hunting, and most of their names we'll never know. The newspapers called him the Gray Man, the Brooklyn Vampire, the Werewolf of Wisteria, the Boogeyman. But his neighbors? They called him a kindly grandfather who fixed their plumbing and smiled at their kids. And you've never heard his name. Hamilton Howard Fish was born in Washington, D.C. in 1870 into a family where madness ran like poison through the bloodline. His father was 75 years old when Albert was born. His mother, just 32. The age gap should have been the first warning sign, but it was Fish's father's death when Albert was 5 that truly set his fate in motion. His widowed mother couldn't care for 4 children alone, so she did what desperate parents did in 1875. She abandoned them to St. John's Home for Boys in Brooklyn, New York. If you think modern orphanages are harsh, imagine this. Children were beaten daily with leather straps. Kids were encouraged to hurt each other. Pain was considered godly discipline. Suffering was salvation. But here's where Albert Fish became different from every other tortured child in that place. He didn't just endure the beatings, he began to crave them. I was there till I was nearly 9, Fish later recalled. And that's where I got started wrong. We were unmercifully whipped. I saw boys doing many things they should not have done. The pain became pleasure. The beatings became ecstasy. By age 9, Albert Fish had rewired his brain to associate violence with sexual gratification. When his mother finally retrieved him in 1880, it was already too late. At 12, Fish began a relationship with an older teenage boy who introduced him to practices so depraved they have medical names: urolagnia and coprophagia, the consumption of human waste for sexual pleasure. By his teens, Fish was visiting public baths to watch boys undress, writing obscene letters to women, prostituting himself while molesting children he lured from their homes. This was 1880s America. Child protection didn't exist. Missing children were often written off as runaways. Families were desperate. Children were vulnerable. And Albert Fish was learning how to hunt. But then, something strange happened. In 1898, Fish married a woman and had 6 children of his own. For nearly 20 years, he lived what appeared to be a normal life. House painter by day, family man by night. His own children were never harmed, never touched. It was as if some part of his broken mind understood the difference between his family and everyone else's. But that restraint wouldn't last forever. In 1910, while working as a house painter in Delaware, Fish met a man named Thomas Kedden. What started as a sadomasochistic relationship quickly became something far worse. Just 10 days after meeting Kedden, Fish lured him to an abandoned farmhouse. He locked him inside and tortured him for 2 weeks. He mutilated Kedden's body, cutting off half his penis before disappearing into the night. I shall never forget his scream, Fish later recalled with satisfaction, or the look he gave me. Kedden survived, but barely, and Fish had tasted something new, complete power over another human being. In 1917, Fish's wife left him for another man. Whatever remained of his sanity snapped. He became obsessed with self-harm, pressing dozens of needles into his groin. So many that X-rays taken years later showed his pelvis looked like a pincushion. He would stuff wool soaked in lighter fluid into his rectum and set it on fire. But the most terrifying change was how he began treating his own children. Fish started teaching them games, strange, sadomasochistic rituals. He would invite them to eat raw meat with him, describing in detail how it had been prepared. His children watched their father transform from a quiet painter into something else entirely. By 1919, Fish was ready to begin his true life's work. He developed a system. He would scan local newspapers for advertisements, young men looking for work, families seeking household help. He particularly targeted what he called undesirable children, the intellectually disabled, orphans, homeless black youths, children he believed wouldn't be missed. His first confirmed victim was Frances McDonnell, 8 years old. The 15th of July, 1924. Francis was playing on his family's porch in Staten Island when a gray-haired, frail old man walked past, muttering to himself. Hours later, when Francis was playing in the nearby woods, his friends saw him walk away with a man matching that same description. Francis's body was found the next day under some branches, beaten and strangled with his own suspenders. Fish later confessed he had been ready to dismember the boy when he heard someone approaching and fled. But Francis was just practice. Because Albert Fish was about to commit crimes so calculated, so methodical, they would redefine what evil looked like in America. The 11th of February, 1927, 4-year-old Billy Gaffney was playing with his friend, also named Billy, outside their Brooklyn apartment building. The friend later told police that the boogeyman had taken Billy away. Adults dismissed this as childish imagination until their search of the entire neighborhood produced no clues. Billy Gaffney had simply vanished. Fish later described Billy's murder in nauseating detail. I took tools, a good heavy cat of 9 tails, homemade, short handle, cut one of my belts in half, slit these halves in 6 strips about 8 inches long. I whipped his bare behind till the blood ran from his legs. I cut off his ears, slit his mouth from ear to ear, gouged out his eyes. He was dead. Then I stuck the knife in his belly and held my mouth to his body and drank his blood. Billy's body was never found. Fish had become skilled at disposal, but it was his next victim who would prove to be both his greatest triumph and his ultimate downfall. May 28th, 1928. The Budd family lived at 406 West 15th Street in Manhattan. struggling through the depression like millions of others. When 18-year-old Edward Budd placed a job advertisement in the New York World newspaper, he had no idea he was about to invite death into his home. The man who knocked on their door introduced himself as Frank Howard, a farmer from Long Island looking for help with his farm. Well-dressed, polite, with wire-rimmed glasses, and a grandfatherly smile. He spoke softly about his wife and children, promised Edward steady work. Mrs. Budd invited him to stay for lunch, but during that meal, Fish's attention shifted to someone else entirely. 10-year-old Grace Budd, dark hair, trusting eyes, sitting at the family table in her white confirmation dress. As Fish watched Grace eat, laugh, play with her siblings, something changed in his mind. This wasn't just another potential victim. This was going to be a special. After lunch, Fish mentioned having to attend his niece's birthday party. Lots of children, games, cake. Would Grace like to come? The Budds hesitated. They barely knew this man, but he seemed so gentle, so trustworthy. Grace was clapping her hands with excitement. "She can go," Albert Budd finally said. "It would be good for her." They dressed Grace in her finest white dress, the same confirmation dress she'd worn to church that morning. Fish took her small hand in his, promised to have her back by 9 o'clock, and walked her out into the afternoon sun. Grace Budd skipped beside him, chattering about the party, completely unaware she was walking to her death. She would never be seen alive again. Fish didn't take Grace to any birthday party. Instead, he led her to an abandoned house he had scouted weeks earlier, a crumbling structure in Westchester County called Wisteria Cottage, the perfect place for what he had planned. "Grace," he told her gently, "wait outside and pick some wildflowers while I get ready for the party." Grace obeyed, gathering flowers in the overgrown yard, humming to herself. She had no idea that upstairs Albert Fish was stripping naked, arranging his tools, preparing for what he considered a holy ritual. When Fish called Grace inside, she climbed the stairs eagerly, still holding her wildflowers. The moment she saw him naked, everything changed. Grace tried to run. Fish grabbed her. She screamed that she would tell her mama, but there was no one to hear her cries. What happened next was described in Fish's own words in the letter he would send to Grace's mother 6 years later. "First, I stripped her naked. How she did kick, bite, and scratch. I choked her to death, then cut her in small pieces so I could take my meat to my rooms, cook, and eat it. How sweet and tender her little ass was roasted in the oven. It took me 9 days to eat her entire body. I did not flass her, though I could have had I wished. She died a virgin." But here's what makes Fish's crime even more horrifying. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was methodical, planned. He had brought tools, knives, saws, cooking implements. He had prepared everything in advance. Fish dismembered Grace's body with surgical precision. He wrapped the pieces in newspaper, loaded them into a suitcase, and calmly took the train back to New York City. For 9 days, Albert Fish cooked and consumed a 10-year-old girl in his boarding house room, while his neighbors went about their daily lives, completely unaware a cannibal was living among them. Meanwhile, the Budd family was going insane with worry. When Frank Howard didn't return Grace by 9 o'clock, they called the police. Detective William King of the Missing Persons Bureau took the case personally. King quickly discovered that the address of the supposed birthday party didn't exist. There was no record of a farmer named Frank Howard on Long Island. The man had simply vanished. taking Grace with him. What followed was one of the largest manhunts in New York City history. 6 years of dead ends, false leads, and growing despair. The Budd family hired private detectives. They begged newspapers to keep Grace's story alive. They prayed she might still be alive somewhere, might walk through their door at any moment. But Fish was just getting started. Over the next few years, more children disappeared. Fish claimed to have killed a child in every state in America. Over 100 victims in total. But because he targeted society's most vulnerable children, many disappearances went unreported or uninvestigated. Fish had perfected his system. He would fast for days before each kill, believing it purified his body to receive the sacrifice. He would study his victims for weeks, learning their routines, their families, their weaknesses. His boarding house room became a shrine to suffering. Investigators would later find an arsenal of torture implements: needles, knives, meat cleavers, paddles studded with nails. X-rays revealed over 24 needles permanently embedded in his pelvic region, driven so deep they scraped against bone when he walked. But the most disturbing discovery wasn't the weapons. It was his correspondence. Albert Fish had been writing letters, dozens of them, to families of missing children throughout the country. Each letter described in graphic detail what he had done to their babies, how they had tasted, how they had screamed, how they had died, how he had thanked God for the privilege of consuming them. Most of these letters he never sent. They were like diary entries, records of his conquests, trophies of his kills. But in the 19th of November 34, 6 years after Grace Budd's disappearance, something changed. Fish decided the Budd family deserved to know the truth. He sat down in his boarding house room and wrote 6 pages of careful handwriting. Not an apology, not a confession born of guilt, but a detailed recipe for murder, written with the precision of a cookbook. The letter arrived at the Budd home on the 12th of November, 1934. Mercifully, Grace's mother Delia couldn't read. The task fell to her son Edward, who would carry those words with him forever. "My dear Mrs. Budd," it began innocently. "On Sunday, the 3rd of June 1928, I called on you at 406 West 15th Street, brought you pot cheese, strawberries. We had lunch. Grace sat in my lap and kissed me. I made up my mind to eat her." The letter went on to describe every detail of Grace's murder with scientific precision. How Fish had stripped naked to avoid getting blood on his clothes. How Grace had tried to run when she saw him. How he had strangled her, dismembered her, cooked her. How sweet and tender her little ass was roasted in the oven, he wrote. All other parts of her body were prepared and consumed. How she did kick, bite, and scratch. But Fish wasn't done. He wanted the Budds to know that their daughter's death hadn't been quick, that she had suffered, that he had savored every moment. The letter was signed, Albert H. Fish. When Delia Budd learned what the letter contained, she collapsed in the street, screaming. But in her horror, she had also been given something Detective King desperately needed: a name. And Fish had made a crucial mistake. Edward Budd rushed the letter to Detective King, who had been haunted by Grace's case for 6 years. King examined every detail of that letter like it was a treasure map, because in many ways it was. One small detail caught his eye: a faint logo in the corner bearing the letters NYPCBA. This was it. After 6 years of dead ends, they finally had a real clue. King traced those letters like a bloodhound. They stood for New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association. He contacted the organization and learned that a member named Lee Sikowski had taken some letterhead home. Sikowski admitted he had left several sheets at a boarding house where he'd been staying, 200 East 52nd Street. When King arrived at that boarding house and asked about an elderly tenant, the landlord's description made his blood run cold. Gray hair, wire-rimmed glasses, soft-spoken, polite. Exactly how the Budd family had described Frank Howard. But now, King had his real name, Albert Fish. On the 13th of December, 1934, Detective King climbed the stairs to room 7. He knocked on the door, his hand resting on his gun. Albert Fish answered, looking exactly as he had 6 years earlier. The same kind eyes, the same grandfatherly smile. "Are you Albert Fish?" King asked. "Yes," Fish replied calmly. "I've been expecting you." Fish didn't run. He didn't deny anything. He didn't even seem surprised. He invited King inside, offered him a seat, and began to confess in the same matter-of-fact tone he might use to discuss the weather. But what King found in that small room would haunt him for the rest of his life. Rolls of bandages, bottles of peroxide, a meat cleaver wrapped in newspaper, and in a small tin box, dozens of letters Fish had written to families of missing children. Letters he had never sent. Each letter described what he had done to their babies in pornographic detail. Fish sat quietly as King examined the evidence, occasionally nodding as if approving of the detective's thoroughness. "I never could account for it," Fish said, his voice trembling slightly with what sounded like excitement rather than remorse. "The things I did, but I had to do them. God told me to." As King continued searching, Fish kept talking, and what he confessed revealed that Grace Budd was just one victim in a campaign of terror that had lasted 40 years. "There are so many," Fish whispered, "in every state. God's work is never finished." Albert Fish's trial began on the 11th of March, 1935, in White Plains, New York. The courtroom was packed with reporters from around the world, curious onlookers, and family members of missing children who hoped to finally learn the truth. The case presented an impossible question. Was Albert Fish evil, or was he insane? His defense attorney argued that no sane person could commit such acts. They presented evidence of Fish's lifetime of self-torture, his religious delusions, his obvious mental illness. They showed the jury X-rays of Fish's pelvis, revealing the dozens of needles he had driven into his own body. Court-appointed psychiatrists testified that Fish was the most polymorphous pervert I have ever known. They described his bizarre sexual practices, his obsession with pain, his belief that God commanded him to hurt children. But the prosecution painted a different picture. They argued that Fish's crimes were too methodical, too carefully planned to be the work of a madman. He had posed as Frank Howard to gain the Budd family's trust. He had scouted locations in advance. He had avoided capture for decades through careful planning. If Fish was insane, how could he be so organized? If he was sane, how could anyone commit such acts? The jury heard hours of testimony about Fish's crimes. They listened to recordings of his confessions, delivered in his calm, grandfatherly voice. as if he were reading a grocery list. During the trial, Fish showed no emotion. He sat quietly in his chair, occasionally nodding as testimony was read, sometimes smiling as if he were enjoying the attention. When asked if he had anything to say in his own defense, Fish stood slowly and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "I have nothing to say. What I did was what I had to do. God's will be done." But just before the jury retired to deliberate, Fish made one final statement that chilled everyone in that courtroom to the bone. "There are others," he said, his eyes scanning the packed gallery. "So many others. In places you haven't even looked. Children you haven't even missed yet." The jury deliberated for less than an hour. They found Albert Fish guilty of murder in the first degree. The judge sentenced him to death. But Fish's final words haunted investigators. How many children had really died? How many families would never know the truth about their missing babies? The true scope of Albert Fish's evil would die with him. On the 16th of January, 1936, Albert Fish was executed in the electric chair at Sing Sing prison. He was 65 years old. Witnesses said Fish appeared almost eager as he was strapped into the chair. His final words were reportedly, "I don't even know why I'm here." But even his execution was disturbing. The first jolt of electricity failed to kill him. Some claimed it was because of all the needles in his body, though this was likely myth. It took a second surge to finally end the life of America's most depraved killer. Prior to his death, Fish was permitted to write a series of notes regarding his crimes to help reporters understand the full scope of his evil. But his attorney, Jack Dempsey, refused to make them public. "I will never show it to anyone," Dempsey said. "It was the most filthy string of obscenities that I have ever read." Those notes were destroyed. Whatever secrets they contained about Fish's other victims went to the grave with him. Albert Fish was buried in an unmarked grave. No family claimed his body. No mourners attended his funeral. The world seemed eager to forget he had ever existed, but his evil didn't die with him. To this day, investigators believe Fish may have murdered as many as 100 children over his 40-year career. Only 3 deaths. Grace Budd, Billy Gaffney, and Francis McDonnell were ever definitively proven. The rest remain open questions, cold cases, families who never learned what happened to their babies. Fish once bragged that he had abused or eaten a child in every U.S. state. While this was likely an exaggeration, the truth is we'll never know the real number. Here's what's truly terrifying about Albert Fish. He proves that monsters don't just exist in horror movies. They live next door. They fix your plumbing. They attend church. They smile at your children at the grocery store. They look exactly like someone you'd trust. Fish wasn't a wild-eyed maniac or a Hollywood villain. He was a quiet grandfather figure who helped elderly neighbors carry groceries and never caused trouble. For 40 years, he moved through American society completely undetected, leaving a trail of dead children in his wake. He felt no remorse, no guilt, no recognition that his victims were real people with futures he had stolen. To him, they were ingredients in a recipe, sacrifices in a religious ritual, objects to be consumed. Fish once wrote, "I am not insane, I am just queer." He believed his actions were divinely inspired, that he was carrying out God's will by torturing innocent children. And that raises the question that should keep you awake at night. How many Albert Fishes are out there right now? How many monsters are walking among us, wearing human faces, perfecting their smiles, choosing their next victims? Because if Albert Fish taught us anything, it's this: true evil doesn't announce itself with fangs and claws. It doesn't hide in dark forests or abandoned buildings. True evil knocks politely on your door, introduces itself with a firm handshake and a kind smile, and asks if your children would like to come to a party. The gray man is gone, but somewhere, in some quiet neighborhood, another predator is putting on his mask, practicing his grandfather voice, and planning his next hunt.